In the winter of 1898, patients at Riverside General Hospital in Wheeling, West Virginia, began dying at 3 times the normal rate. What the families didn't know was that their loved ones weren't succumbing to their illnesses. They were being systematically murdered by the very person sworn to heal them. The woman responsible would become known as America's most heartless nurse, a predator who turned medicine into poison and compassion into calculated cruelty. Her name was Margaret Wells, and by the time authorities uncovered her crimes, she had already claimed dozens of innocent lives. This is the true story of how one woman's descent into darkness transformed a place of healing into a house of horrors, and how her reign of terror went undetected for nearly 2 years. Margaret Wells arrived at Riverside General Hospital in March of 1897, carrying impeccable references and a warm, reassuring smile that immediately put patients at ease. At 34 years old, she possessed the kind of maternal presence that made families feel confident leaving their most vulnerable loved ones in her care. The hospital itself was a sprawling 3-story brick building that overlooked the Ohio River, its Gothic windows and imposing towers lending it an almost cathedral-like appearance. Inside, gas lamps cast flickering shadows down long corridors that echoed with the soft footsteps of nurses and the occasional groan of suffering patients. Margaret was assigned to Ward 7, the medical wing, where the hospital's sickest patients fought their battles against tuberculosis, pneumonia, and various wasting diseases. It was here, surrounded by those closest to death, that she would find her perfect hunting ground. From the beginning, Margaret displayed an unusual interest in the hospital's medicine cabinet. She volunteered for extra shifts, often working late into the night when the hospital was staffed with only a skeleton crew. Her colleagues noted her dedication with admiration, unaware that they were witnessing the methodical preparation of a serial killer. The first suspicious death occurred just 6 weeks after Margaret's arrival. Thomas Brennan, a 52-year-old factory worker recovering from pneumonia, had been showing steady improvement when he suddenly took a violent turn for the worse. He convulsed violently in his bed, his skin turning a peculiar shade of blue before he died, in apparent agony. Dr. Harrison Clark, the attending physician, was puzzled by the sudden deterioration. Pneumonia patients didn't typically die with such violent symptoms, but in an era before sophisticated toxicology tests, he had little choice but to attribute the death to complications from the illness. What Dr. Clark didn't know was that Margaret had administered a lethal dose of strychnine to Thomas's evening medication, watching with cold fascination as the poison ravaged his nervous system. Over the following months, Ward 7 developed a grim reputation throughout the hospital. Patients who arrived with manageable conditions began dying at an alarming rate, their deaths marked by similar patterns of sudden deterioration and violent final moments. Margaret's colleagues began to notice her unusual behavior around these deaths. While other nurses showed visible distress when patients passed away, Margaret remained eerily composed, often volunteering to prepare the bodies for the morgue. Some noted that she seemed almost energized by the experience, her usually pale complexion taking on a healthy flush in the aftermath of a death. Sarah Henderson, a junior nurse who worked alongside Margaret, would later testify about the unsettling atmosphere that surrounded her senior colleague. In her written statement, she recalled, "Miss Wells had a way of knowing which patients wouldn't make it through the night. She'd make comments about their color or breathing that seemed almost prophetic. At first, I thought it was experience, but there was something cold in her eyes when she spoke of death." The hospital's administration, however, was not entirely oblivious to the mounting casualties. Dr. Franklin Moore, the chief of medicine, had begun tracking mortality rates across different wards and noticed the disturbing spike in Ward 7. But rather than suspecting foul play, he attributed the deaths to the ward's reputation for taking the most critical cases. Margaret had been careful to select victims who were already seriously ill, making their deaths appear natural to casual observation. She preferred elderly patients and those with chronic conditions, knowing that their deaths would raise fewer questions. Her victims included retired coal miners with black lung disease, elderly women with heart conditions, and middle-aged men recovering from industrial accidents. Each death followed a similar pattern. The patient would appear to be recovering or holding steady. Then Margaret would volunteer for the night shift, claiming she wanted to provide extra attention to the more serious cases. By morning, the patient would be found dead, their bodies bearing the telltale signs of poisoning that went unrecognized by the medical staff of the time. Margaret's weapon of choice was the hospital's own medicine cabinet, a locked wooden chest that contained various drugs and compounds used in treatment. As a senior nurse, she had legitimate access to these medications, including several substances that could prove lethal in large doses. Her preferred poison was strychnine, a bitter compound commonly used in small doses as a stimulant, but deadly in larger quantities. She also used arsenic, which she obtained from rat poison kept in the hospital's basement storage areas. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning, nausea, vomiting, and eventual organ failure could easily be mistaken for the progression of an existing illness. What made Margaret particularly dangerous was her medical knowledge. She understood how different poisons affected the body and how to mask their effects in the context of a patient's existing condition. A heart patient who died from digitalis overdose would appear to have succumbed to cardiac failure. A respiratory patient killed with morphine would seem to have died from breathing complications. Dr. Moore would later describe the sophistication of Margaret's methods in his testimony to investigators. She demonstrated a thorough understanding of pharmacology that exceeded what we would expect from a nurse of that era. Her ability to predict the exact time and manner of death suggested someone with intimate knowledge of how these substances affected the human body. Margaret also showed remarkable cunning in covering her tracks. She varied her methods, ensuring that no single poison appeared too frequently in toxicology reports. She was careful to space out the deaths, sometimes waiting weeks between murders to avoid creating an obvious pattern. When suspicions began to rise, she would take voluntary time off, allowing mortality rates to return to normal before resuming her deadly work. Margaret's downfall began with the death of 8-year-old Emily Patterson in December of 1898. The little girl had been admitted to Ward 7 with a broken leg from a sledding accident, a routine injury that should have resulted in a full recovery after several weeks of bed rest. Emily's parents, Jacob and Martha Patterson, had specifically requested that Margaret care for their daughter after hearing glowing recommendations from other families whose relatives had been in the ward.
They were told that Margaret had a special gift for comforting children and ensuring they received the best possible care. For the first week of Emily's stay, everything proceeded normally. The fracture was healing properly, and Emily's spirits remained high despite being confined to bed. Margaret showed the child special attention, bringing her extra portions at meals and reading stories during the long evening hours. But on the night of December 15th, Margaret volunteered to work a double shift, claiming she wanted to ensure Emily's comfort during a particularly cold spell. The next morning, the Patterson family arrived to find their daughter dead, her small body contorted in a position that suggested intense suffering in her final moments. Unlike the deaths of elderly or chronically ill patients, Emily's death could not be easily explained away. Children didn't typically die from broken bones, and the violent nature of her final moments raised immediate questions among the medical staff. Dr. Clark, who had been troubled by the unusual number of deaths in Ward 7, finally demanded a thorough investigation. He contacted the Wheeling Police Department and requested that Emily's body be examined by the county coroner. The autopsy revealed massive concentrations of strychnine in Emily's system, far more than could be explained by any legitimate medical treatment. The coroner, Dr. William Hayes, had no choice but to rule the death a homicide. News of Emily Patterson's murder sent shockwaves through Wheeling's medical community. The idea that a trusted nurse could deliberately poison a child challenged everything the public believed about the sanctity of medical care. Detective Robert Sullivan was assigned to lead the investigation, and he immediately focused his attention on Ward 7's unusual mortality rate. Working with hospital administrators, he compiled a comprehensive list of every death that had occurred in the ward since Margaret's arrival. The statistics told a chilling story. In the 21 months since Margaret began working at Riverside General, Ward 7 had recorded 93 deaths, compared to an average of 32 in previous years. The majority of these deaths had occurred during shifts when Margaret was the attending nurse. Sullivan began interviewing Margaret's colleagues, and a disturbing picture emerged of a woman who seemed to derive satisfaction from suffering and death. Nurse Henderson revealed that Margaret often made inappropriate comments about patients who were struggling, referring to them as lost causes who would be better off out of their misery. Dr. Moore told investigators about Margaret's unique interest in the medicine cabinet and her tendency to volunteer for night shifts when patients were at their most vulnerable. He also revealed that several medications had gone missing from the hospital's inventory, including significant quantities of strychnine and morphine.
As the investigation deepened, Sullivan discovered that Margaret's employment history was built on fabricated references. The hospitals that had supposedly provided glowing recommendations had no record of employing anyone by that name. Her entire professional identity was an elaborate fiction designed to gain access to vulnerable patients. Confronted with mounting evidence, Margaret Wells was arrested on December 28, 1898, 13 days after Emily Patterson's death. She was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, making her one of the first serial killers in American history to be prosecuted under modern legal standards. Initially, Margaret maintained her innocence, claiming that she was being made a scapegoat for the hospital's poor conditions and inadequate medical care. She portrayed herself as a dedicated nurse who had simply been unlucky enough to work in a ward where death was commonplace. But as prosecutors presented evidence linking her to specific poisoning incidents, Margaret's facade began to crumble. Under intense questioning, she finally broke down and provided a partial confession that shocked even experienced investigators with its casual brutality. They were going to die anyway.
she told Detective Sullivan during one interrogation session. "I just helped them along. Some of them thanked me for ending their suffering." When pressed about Emily Patterson, Margaret showed no remorse. "The child was in pain from her injury. I gave her peace." The trial began in March of 1899 and attracted national attention as newspapers across the country covered the proceedings. The prosecution presented testimony from surviving patients who had experienced suspicious symptoms after receiving medication from Margaret, as well as expert witnesses who explained how various poisons had been used to kill her victims. Margaret's defense attorney argued that she was mentally ill and could not be held responsible for her actions. He brought in psychiatrists who testified about various disorders that could cause violent behavior, but their testimony was undermined by evidence of Margaret's careful planning and methodical approach to the murders. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Margaret Wells was sentenced to death, becoming one of the first women in West Virginia history to receive capital punishment for serial murder. In the weeks leading up to her execution, Margaret finally revealed the full scope of her crimes in a series of interviews with investigators. She admitted to killing at least 47 patients during her time at Riverside General, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Her motives, she explained, were complex and deeply disturbing. She claimed that she had developed an addiction to the power of deciding who lived and who died, describing the experience of watching patients succumb to her poisons as intoxicating. She also revealed a twisted form of mercy, claiming that she had chosen victims who she believed were suffering unnecessarily. Most chilling of all was her admission that she had been killing patients long before her arrival at Riverside General. She confessed to similar crimes at hospitals in Pennsylvania and Ohio, suggesting that her total victim count might have exceeded 100 people. Margaret Wells was executed by hanging on August 15, 1899, maintaining her composure to the end. Her final words were reportedly, "I go to judgment with a clear conscience, knowing that I relieved suffering wherever I found it." The Margaret Wells case sent shockwaves through America's medical establishment, forcing hospitals nationwide to reconsider their hiring practices and security procedures. Riverside General implemented new protocols for medication storage and administration, requiring multiple signatures for dangerous drugs and establishing oversight procedures for night shift activities. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of patients who placed absolute trust in their caregivers. In an era when medical knowledge was limited and patient advocacy was virtually non-existent, individuals like Margaret could operate with impunity for extended periods. Dr. Moore, who had served as chief of medicine during Margaret's reign of terror, never fully recovered from the trauma of learning that his hospital had been the site of systematic murder. He resigned his position shortly after the trial and spent his remaining years advocating for stricter oversight of medical professionals. The families of Margaret's victims struggled with guilt and anger, knowing that their loved ones had died not from illness, but from the deliberate actions of someone they had trusted completely. Many filed lawsuits against the hospital, leading to significant changes in how medical institutions handled liability and patient safety. More than a century after Margaret Wells' execution, her case continues to raise disturbing questions about the nature of medical care and the potential for abuse within healthcare systems. How many other Margaret Wells have operated in the shadows of medical history, their crimes undetected or attributed to natural causes? The case also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature itself. Margaret appeared to be a caring, dedicated nurse who genuinely wanted to help people. Yet, beneath that facade lurked a predator who found satisfaction in causing death and suffering. Perhaps most troubling of all is the realization that Margaret's crimes were enabled by the very trust that forms the foundation of medical care. Patients and families had no choice but to believe in her competence and compassion, making them easy targets for her deadly intentions. What do you think drives someone to abuse a position of trust so completely? Have you ever wondered about the people caring for your loved ones in hospitals? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what state you're watching from. The legacy of Margaret Wells serves as a reminder that evil can wear a caring face and that vigilance, even in places of healing, remains our best defense against those who would do harm. Her story stands as one of the darkest chapters in American medical history, a testament to the capacity for cruelty that can lurk behind the most trusted facades. If you found this story as disturbing as we did, please subscribe to our channel for more forgotten tales from history's darkest corners. These stories need to be told, if only to ensure that we never forget the lessons they teach us about human nature and the price of misplaced trust.